A mafia boss doesn't stop for the broken and the desperate, but Alessandro Varelli was brought to his knees when his 5-year-old daughter refused to leave a homeless woman shivering in a frozen New York alley. 5 years after he buried an empty casket for his wife, his little girl dragged him into the shadows. The woman looked up in terror. It was her. But when their eyes met, she didn't recognize the man who had mourned her. Only the child remembered, and she wouldn't let go. The bitter wind cutting through Manhattan that December night was not merely cold, it was a punishment, a knife-edged force that howled between the skyscrapers and turned the city into a frozen canyon of concrete and black ice. Despite the ferocity of the winter clawing at the windows, the interior of La Serenata on the Upper East Side was a cocoon of amber light and old-world elegance, insulated from the brutality of the streets by mahogany panels and heavy velvet curtains. The air inside was thick and intimate, perfumed with the scent of roasted garlic, aged wine, and the smoky warmth of truffle oil. Alessandro Varelli, the 38-year-old head of the Varelli crime family, sat in the private back room with his daughter perched on the leather seat beside him, looking less like a father enjoying dinner and more like a predator tolerating a brief pause before the hunt. He was a man constructed of sharp edges and controlled violence, his charcoal overcoat draped over shoulders built by years of street fights and prison yards. His face, carved with the hard lines of a man who had buried too many friends and killed too many enemies, bore the kind of cold stillness that made waiters avert their eyes, a silent broadcast that he was not a man who repeated himself. Dark tattoos crept up his neck like shadows escaping his collar, and his hands, scarred across the knuckles, rested on the white tablecloth with a stillness that was more threat than calm. His obsidian eyes swept the room in a constant, automatic rotation, the exits, the windows, the other diners. Always watching. Always calculating. Beside him, swinging her small legs beneath the table with the impatience of childhood, was Eloane. The 5-year-old was Alessandro's opposite in every way. A tiny son in a beige wool coat and hand-knitted hat, her cheeks flushed pink from the restaurant's warmth, her dark curls escaping from beneath the cream-colored yarn. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest and hummed a tuneless song, utterly unaware that 2 of her father's men stood guard at the front entrance and another watched the alley from a black SUV. The dinner had been a rare indulgence, Eloane's favorite, spaghetti with butter and parmesan. A bribe, if Alessandro was honest, to make up for missing her school play last week. The Soriano situation had demanded his attention. It always demanded his attention. And Eloane had learned, as children of powerful men do, not to ask where Papa went or why he came home with bruised knuckles. A waiter approached with the check, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on the table. Alessandro didn't look at the number. He never did. He placed $500 bills on the leather folder and stood, buttoning his overcoat with the precise movements of a man who never rushed but was never slow. "Come, Stellina," he said, his voice a low rumble softened only for her. "Nana is waiting. She will be upset if you are late for your bedtime story." Eloane slid off the seat, clutching her rabbit in one hand and reaching for her father's fingers with the other. Her small hand disappeared inside his scarred palm. The contrast almost obscene, innocence wrapped in violence. They moved toward the side exit, Alessandro's preferred route. The front door was too exposed, too many eyes on the street. His man, Dante, was already holding the steel door open, the cold rushing in like a warning. "Cars 30 feet to the left, boss," Dante murmured. "Streets clear." Alessandro nodded once, pulling Eloane closer to his side as they stepped into the alley. The cold hit them like a wall, sharp, immediate, punishing. Eloane gasped and pressed her face into her father's coat, and Alessandro quickened his pace, eager to get her into the heated interior of the armored Escalade. They had taken exactly 12 steps when Eloane stopped. Her hand went rigid in his grip. Her feet planted on the frozen concrete as if they had grown roots. Alessandro tugged gently. "Eloane. Come." She didn't move. He looked down, irritation flickering across his features, and found his daughter staring into the darkness beside a rusted dumpster. Her brown eyes, her mother's eyes, God help him, were wide and fixed on something in the shadows. "Stelina, we need to go. Now." "Papa," Eloan whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "There's a lady. She's crying." Alessandro's jaw tightened. He didn't look. He didn't need to. The alleys of New York were filled with the broken, the addicted, the lost. He had stepped over 100 of them in his life without a second glance. They were not his concern. They were not his responsibility. "She is fine," he said, pulling again. "The car is warm. Let's go." But Eloan did something she had never done before. She pulled her hand free from his. Before Alessandro could react, his daughter walked toward the shadows, her small beige coat bright against the filth of the alley, her knitted hat bobbing with each determined step. She stopped in front of the dumpster and knelt in the grime and the snow, utterly unafraid. "Hi," Eloan said softly, her voice carrying the pure, unjudging warmth that only children possess. "Are you cold?" "I'm cold too. But my papa has a warm car. Do you want to come?" Alessandro stood frozen, his hand still extended where his daughter's fingers had been. Dante shifted beside him, uncertain, waiting for orders. And then the woman in the shadows looked up. The street lamp caught her face, gaunt, hollow, framed by tangled dark hair matted with filth. Her cheeks were bruised, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. She wore layers of torn clothing, clutching a battered guitar case to her chest like a shield, her entire body trembling with a fear that went beyond the winter. Her eyes, wide, terrified, the color of dark honey, met Alessandro's. And the world stopped. He knew those eyes. He had seen them every night for 5 years in his dreams. He had seen them in the face of his daughter every single day. He had seen them in the photograph on his nightstand, the one he couldn't bring himself to remove even after he stood in the rain and watched an empty casket lowered into the ground. Maribel. The name echoed through his skull like a gunshot. His wife. The mother of his child. The woman he had buried 5 years ago after the car bombing that was meant for him. She was alive. She was here. She was looking at him like he was a stranger. "Papa?" Eloan's voice cut through the roaring in his ears. She had taken the woman's filthy hand in her small clean one and was looking back at her father with an expression of simple, devastating expectation. "She needs help. You always say we help people who need help." Alessandro couldn't speak. His lungs had forgotten how to work. The woman, Maribel, flinched at the sound of Eloan's voice, trying to pull away, but the little girl held firm with a grip that belied her size. "It's okay," Eloan said softly, turning back to the trembling stranger. "My papa looks scary, but he's not. He's warm, like a bear. He'll keep you safe." The wind howled through the alley. Dante's hand hovered near his weapon, confused by his boss's paralysis. And Alessandro Virelli, the man who had ordered executions without blinking, who had built an empire on blood and fear, felt something crack open in his chest that he had sealed shut the day he buried his wife. His daughter was still holding the woman's hand. She was still waiting. "Dante," Alessandro said, his voice barely a rasp. "Get the car. Now." The dinner had been Eloan's reward, or perhaps Alessandro's penance. He had missed her school play 3 days ago. Some nonsense about snowflakes and singing, her teacher had explained in a voicemail he deleted without finishing. The Soriano situation had demanded a meeting in Jersey, the kind of meeting that ended with plastic sheets and bleach, and by the time Alessandro returned to the penthouse, Eloan was already asleep in her bed, still wearing the cotton ball costume her nanny had helped her make. She hadn't cried. That was the worst part. She had simply looked at him the next morning with those enormous brown eyes, her mother's eyes, always her mother's eyes, and said, "It's okay, Papa. Maybe next time." There would be no next time. The play was over. And Alessandro had learned long ago that there were no second chances in his world, only consequences. So tonight, he had taken her to La Serenata. Her favorite. Spaghetti with butter and parmesan, no sauce, extra cheese, a dish that would have made his Sicilian grandmother weep with shame. But Eloane had eaten every bite, chattering about her rabbit, her teacher, the boy in her class who picked his nose during circle time. Alessandro had listened to all of it, offering the occasional grunt of acknowledgement, while his eyes swept the room in an automatic, endless rotation. 2 exits. 6 tables occupied. The couple by the window had been there too long, nursing the same glasses of wine for over an hour. The man near the bar kept glancing at his phone. The kitchen door swung open every 4 minutes, he had counted. This was the tax of his existence. He could never simply be a father eating dinner with his daughter. He was always the Don, always calculating threat assessments and exit strategies, always wearing the iron suit of paranoia that had kept him alive for 38 years. Eloane noticed none of it. She lived in a world of rabbits and spaghetti and bedtime stories, a world Alessandro had built for her with walls of money and violence. She didn't know that the friendly man who drove her to school carried 2 guns. She didn't know that her bedroom window was bulletproof glass. She didn't know that her father had killed 11 men, 14, if you counted the ones he had ordered killed rather than done himself. She knew only that Papa was busy, that Papa was important, and that Papa always smelled like expensive cologne and sometimes like cigarette smoke when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Papa, she said now, tugging his hand as they moved through the restaurant's back hallway, do you think Nana will let me stay up late? No. But it's almost Christmas. Christmas is in 3 weeks, Stellina. That's almost. Alessandro felt the corner of his mouth twitch. She had her mother's stubbornness too, the same quiet, relentless persistence that had once convinced him to take a walk on the beach, to try dancing, to believe he could be something other than a monster. He crushed the memory before it could fully form. We will see, he said, which they both knew meant no. Dante was waiting at the side exit, his breath fogging in the cold air that seeped through the gap beneath the door. Cars ready, boss. Streets quiet. Alessandro nodded, pulling Eloane closer. The iron suit tightened around him as he prepared to step outside. He had no idea that in 30 seconds, his daughter would shatter it completely. The cold hit them like a fist. Alessandro pulled Eloane against his side, shielding her small body from the wind that came howling down the alley like something alive and angry. The temperature had dropped since they entered the restaurant. He could feel it in the way the air bit at his exposed skin, in the way his breath turned to white vapor before it left his lips. 30 feet, boss, Dante murmured, already moving toward the idling Escalade. Its headlights cut through the darkness, twin beacons of warmth and safety. Alessandro quickened his pace. Eloane's legs were short, and she half-jogged to keep up, her stuffed rabbit bouncing against her chest. 12 steps. That was all. 12 steps and they would be in the heated leather interior, and he could stop scanning the shadows for threats that probably weren't there but might be, always might be. 11 steps. 10. 9. Eloane stopped. The sudden resistance nearly pulled Alessandro off balance. He looked down, irritation already hardening his features, and found his daughter frozen in place. Her small body had gone rigid, her eyes fixed on something in the darkness beside a overflowing dumpster. Eloane. Come. She didn't move. Didn't even look at him. Stellina. His voice sharpened. The car. Now. Papa. Her whisper was almost lost in the wind. There's a lady. Alessandro didn't look. He had trained himself long ago not to look at the things that didn't concern him. The alleys of this city were filled with human wreckage, addicts, runaways, the mentally broken. He had stepped over them his entire life. They were invisible to him, as invisible as the rats that scurried through the garbage. She is not our concern, he said. Move. He pulled her hand. She pulled back. And then, for the first time in her 5 years of life, Eloane Varelli defied her father. She yanked her fingers free from his grip and walked into the shadows. Eloane. The word came out harder than he intended, sharp enough to echo off the brick walls. Dante's hand moved toward his weapon, confused, unsure if there was a threat. But Eloane didn't stop. She walked straight toward the dumpster, her beige coat impossibly bright against the filth, her small shoes crunching through the frozen slush. She stopped in front of a pile of cardboard and trash that Alessandro had dismissed as debris, and she knelt. She knelt in the grime and the ice, ruining her coat, and reached out her hand. "Hi," she said softly. "Don't be scared. I'm Eloane." Alessandro stood paralyzed, his hand still extended in the empty air where his daughter's fingers had been. Something was wrong. Something was pulling at the edges of his mind, a warning he couldn't name. And then the pile of trash moved. A figure uncurled from the shadows. A woman, skeletal and trembling, wrapped in layers of torn clothing that did nothing against the cold. She clutched a battered guitar case to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white, her entire body flinching away from the child's outstretched hand. "Eloane," Alessandro growled, stepping forward. "Get away from." The woman looked up. The street lamp caught her face, and Alessandro's heart stopped. He knew that face. He knew it better than his own. He had traced those cheekbones in the darkness of their bedroom. He had kissed those lips on their wedding day. He had watched those eyes, honey brown, flecked with gold, close for the last time in a photograph the coroner had shown him, a photograph of a body so burned he had to identify her by dental records. Maribel. The name detonated in his chest like the car bomb that was supposed to have killed her. But she was here. She was alive. She was huddled in the garbage behind a Manhattan dumpster, gaunt and bruised and shaking, looking at him with absolutely no recognition. She looked at him like he was a stranger. She looked at him like she was afraid. "Papa?" Eloane's voice came from very far away. She was still holding the woman's filthy hand, still kneeling in the snow, still waiting for her father to be the man she believed him to be. "She's so cold. Can we help her? Please." Alessandro couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but stare at the ghost of his wife, alive and broken and utterly lost. 5 years. 5 years he had mourned her. 5 years he had raised their daughter alone. 5 years he had told himself that the hollow space in his chest was just the price of survival. And she had been here. Somewhere. Suffering. Forgetting. Forgetting him. "Boss?" Dante's voice was tight with confusion. "What do we?" "Get the car." Alessandro's voice didn't sound like his own. It was raw, cracked, the voice of a man who had just watched his world tear itself apart. "Bring it here. Now." He moved forward on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and knelt beside his daughter in the filth and the cold. The woman, Maribel, God, Maribel, tried to scramble backward, a sound of terror escaping her cracked lips. "No," Alessandro said, and his voice broke on the word. "No, mi alma. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand. She didn't know him. But Eloane did. His daughter looked up at him with her mother's eyes, the same eyes that were now staring at him in fear from a stranger's ruined face, and smiled. "See?" Eloane said to the trembling woman, patting her hand like she was soothing a frightened animal. "I told you. Papa helps people." Alessandro felt something shatter inside him. He had spent 5 years becoming a monster. And now his daughter was asking him to become a man again. The drive to the Hamptons took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Alessandro counted every second. Maribel had refused to enter the Escalade until Eloane climbed in first, reaching back with her small hand like a lifeline. Even then, she had pressed herself against the door, as far from Alessandro as the leather interior would allow, clutching her guitar case like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. She didn't speak. She didn't look at him. She simply trembled, a continuous, full-body shiver that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with a terror Alessandro couldn't name. Eloane fell asleep somewhere on the Long Island Expressway, her head dropping onto Maribel's shoulder. The woman had flinched at first, every muscle tensing for flight. But slowly, gradually, her hand had come up to rest on the child's hair, a gesture so familiar, so achingly Maribel, that Alessandro had to look away before he shattered completely. The estate emerged from the darkness like a fortress, because that's what it was. 8 bedrooms, 12,000 square feet, surrounded by walls and cameras and men who would die before letting anyone breach the perimeter. Alessandro had bought it after the bombing, after he buried the empty casket, after he decided that his daughter would grow up behind layers of protection so thick that nothing could ever touch her again. He had never imagined he would bring Maribel here. He had never imagined Maribel was alive to bring everyone out, he told Dante as they pulled through the gates. Staff, security, everyone. I want this house empty in 10 minutes. Boss, that's not 10 minutes. The estate cleared like water draining from a sink. Alessandro carried Eloane to her bedroom, a room she had never slept in, decorated with toys she had never touched, and laid her gently on the bed. She stirred but didn't wake, her rabbit still clutched to her chest. When he returned to the living room, Maribel was standing exactly where he had left her, frozen in the center of the marble floor, her eyes darting to every shadow. You're safe here, Alessandro said quietly. No one will hurt you. She didn't respond. He wasn't sure she had heard him. He moved slowly, the way he would approach a wounded animal, and gestured toward the bathroom. She followed at a distance, clutching the guitar case, never letting it leave her grip. In the bathroom's harsh light, the damage was worse than he had realized. Bruises layered over bruises. A cut on her temple that had scabbed and reopened. Dirt ground so deep into her skin it had become part of her. Alessandro wet a cloth with warm water and knelt before her. His hands, scarred, tattooed, stained with sins she would never know, trembled as he raised the cloth to her face. She flinched. It's okay, he whispered, his voice cracking. Mi alma. It's just me. But that was the cruelest truth of all. She didn't know who me was anymore. 3 days passed in fragile silence. Maribel existed like a ghost in the estate, drifting from room to room with her guitar case clutched to her chest, never speaking, barely eating. She slept in the guest room at the far end of the hall. Alessandro had offered her the master bedroom, their old bedroom, but the suggestion had sent her retreating into a corner with wild eyes and shallow breaths. She didn't remember any of it. Him. Their wedding. Their life. But Eloane, somehow, impossibly, was breaking through. The child had appointed herself Maribel's shadow, following her with the patient devotion of a small, determined saint. She brought her crayons and drew pictures of rabbits. She sat beside her on the couch and narrated the plots of her favorite cartoons. She held her hand during meals, chattering enough for both of them, filling the silence with a warmth that Alessandro could never provide. And slowly, incrementally, Maribel began to respond. A nod here. A ghost of a smile there. Once, Alessandro had walked past the living room and seen her fingers moving through Eloane's dark curls, the same way she used to do when their daughter was an infant, back when the world made sense. He had stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, unable to move, unable to breathe. On the 4th night, Alessandro decided to try dinner. A real dinner. At the table. Like a family. He cooked himself. Pasta with garlic and olive oil, the first dish Maribel had ever taught him to make, back when they were young and stupid and believed love could protect them from anything. Eloan helped by stirring the pot with exaggerated seriousness, wearing an apron that hung past her knees. Maribel sat at the table, watching them with an expression Alessandro couldn't read. Confusion, maybe. Or the faintest edge of something that might have been longing. Dinner is served, Eloan announced, carrying a basket of bread to the table with the gravity of a royal procession. Papa made it, but I helped. I'm the assistant chef. Alessandro brought the pasta, then the salad, then a bottle of sparkling cider he had found in the pantry. Non-alcoholic. Safe. He twisted the cap, and pop. The sound was small. Insignificant. A tiny release of pressure that should have meant nothing. Maribel screamed. The sound that tore from her throat was not human. It was animal, primal, a sound of pure terror that turned Alessandro's blood to ice. She threw herself backward, her chair crashing to the floor, and scrambled into the corner of the room, her hands clawing at the walls like she was trying to dig through them. The CR, she shrieked, her voice cracking. The car is on fire. I can't get out. They're coming. They're coming for me. Eloan burst into tears. Alessandro moved without thinking, positioning himself between his daughter and the woman who was clawing at her own arms, leaving red tracks on her skin. Maribel. He kept his voice low, steady. Maribel, you're safe. There's no fire. There's no car. But she wasn't here. She was somewhere else, 5 years ago, trapped in burning metal, watching shadows approach through the flames. They said I was dead, she whimpered, collapsing into herself. They said I had to stay dead. Or they'd kill her. They'd kill the baby. Alessandro's heart stopped. She hadn't died in that explosion. She had escaped. And she had stayed hidden, stayed dead, to protect Eloan. The truth hit him like a bullet to the chest. Someone had taken his wife from him. And they were still out there. Alessandro waited until Maribel's sobs had faded into exhausted sleep before he made the call. She lay curled on the guest bed, Eloan tucked against her side. His daughter had refused to leave, had crawled up beside the broken woman and held her hand until they both drifted off. Alessandro stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of their breathing, before he pulled the door shut and walked to his study. The room was soundproofed. He had insisted on it when the estate was built. He dialed the only number he trusted. Marco Benedetti answered on the second ring. His consigliere, his advisor, the man who had stood beside him since they were boys running packages through Brooklyn. Marco's voice was graveled with sleep, but sharpened instantly when he heard Alessandro speak. I need you here. Now. Bring no one. What happened? Alessandro closed his eyes. The words felt impossible, even now. Maribel is alive. Silence. Then, I'm on my way. Marco arrived in 90 minutes, his silver hair uncombed, his eyes sharp despite the hour. Alessandro met him in the study with 2 glasses of whiskey and a truth that still felt like madness. He told him everything. The alley. Eloan's refusal to leave. The face in the shadows. The 3 days of silence, and then the dinner, the sound of the bottle, and the flood of broken memories that had poured out of his wife like blood from a wound. Marco listened without interrupting. When Alessandro finished, the old man leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. The Sorianos, Marco said. It wasn't a question. It has to be. Alessandro's hands tightened around his glass. The bombing was meant for me. Everyone knew that. But if they took her instead, kept her alive, made her disappear. Psychological warfare. Marco nodded slowly. Kill your wife, you grieve and move on. But this? Knowing she was out there, suffering, and you couldn't save her. That would destroy you. She said they told her to stay dead. Alessandro's voice was barely a whisper. She said they would kill the baby if she came back. Marco's expression hardened. Then she escaped. Somehow, she got out, and she's been hiding ever since. Living on the streets to stay invisible. For 5 years. The words tasted like ash. She's been alone for 5 years, Marco. Thinking she was protecting us. The consigliere was quiet for a moment. Then his eyes narrowed. Alessandro. If she escaped, they've been looking for her. And if you found her in Manhattan? The realization hit them both at the same time. They tracked us from the city, Alessandro said. Marco was already reaching for his phone. We need to move. Tonight. If the Sorianos know she's alive, if they know she's here. A soft chime echoed through the house. The perimeter alarm. Alessandro's blood turned to ice. They already know. The lights died first. One moment the study was bathed in warm amber, the next, absolute darkness swallowed the estate whole. The silence that followed was worse, the absence of the low electrical hum that Alessandro had never noticed until it vanished. They cut the mains, Marco said, already pulling the pistol from his shoulder holster. Backup generator. 10 seconds. They waited. The darkness pressed against them like something physical. The generator didn't kick in. They're already inside the grounds, Alessandro said quietly. They hit the generator first. He moved to the window, staying low, peering through the gap in the curtains. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the lawn in silver and shadow, and in those shadows, shapes were moving. 3. No, 4. Professional spacing, tactical approach, converging on the house from multiple angles. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution. How many men do you have on site? Marco asked. None. I sent them away. The words tasted like broken glass. He had wanted privacy. He had wanted to protect Maribel from prying eyes. And now that decision might kill them all. Alessandro crossed to his desk and pressed the hidden panel beneath the drawer. The compartment slid open, revealing a Beretta 92, 2 spare magazines, and a tactical knife. He armed himself with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Stay here, he told Marco. Watch the front. Anyone comes through that door who isn't me. I know what to do. Alessandro moved through the darkened house like smoke, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. The layout was seared into his memory, every corner, every doorway, every potential ambush point. He had designed this house to be a fortress. Now he would use it as a killing ground. He reached the guest room in 40 seconds. Eloane was awake, her eyes huge in the darkness, her small body pressed against Maribel's side. Maribel was trembling, but her arms were wrapped around the child with a ferocity that made Alessandro's chest ache. Papa? Eloane's voice was barely a whisper. What's happening? Nothing, Stellina. He kept his voice calm, steady. We're going to play a game. You and your friend are going to hide in a special room, and you're going to be very, very quiet. Can you do that for Papa? She nodded, her lower lip trembling. Alessandro lifted them both. Eloane in one arm, guiding Maribel with the other, and carried them down the hall to the master closet. The safe room was hidden behind a false wall, reinforced steel behind mahogany veneer. He punched in the code, and the door swung open with a soft hiss. Stay here, he said, setting Eloane down. Don't open this door for anyone but me. Maribel grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, her fingers ice cold, but her eyes were suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Kill them, she whispered. Kill them all. Alessandro looked at his wife, broken, haunted, but still his, and felt something ancient and savage rise in his chest. I intend to. The door sealed shut behind him. And Alessandro Virelli went hunting. The first man came through the kitchen door. Alessandro was waiting in the shadows beside the refrigerator, pressed against the wall like a coiled spring. The intruder moved with professional silence, his suppressed pistol sweeping the darkness, his night vision goggles giving him a false sense of superiority. He never saw the knife. Alessandro's hand clamped over the man's mouth as the blade slid between his ribs, a quick, precise thrust that pierced the heart and dropped him without a sound. He lowered the body to the tile floor and took the dead man's goggles, slipping them over his own eyes. The world turned green and gray. And now he could see them all. Two more were in the living room, moving toward the stairs. A fourth was circling toward the study, where Marco waited. Alessandro moved through the house like a phantom, decades of violence condensed into muscle memory and cold, calculating rage. The second man died in the hallway. Alessandro came up behind him and snapped his neck with a single, brutal twist. The body crumpled, and Alessandro caught it before it could hit the floor, easing it down in silence. The third heard something, a whisper of movement, a shift in the air, and spun around, his weapon rising. Alessandro was faster. 2 shots from the suppressed Beretta, center mass, and the man collapsed against the banister with a wet gurgle. That left 1. A gunshot echoed from the study, loud, unsuppressed. Marco's weapon. Alessandro sprinted down the hall and burst through the door to find his consigliere standing over a body, smoke curling from his pistol. He was quick, Marco said, breathing hard. I was quicker. That's 4. Alessandro scanned the room, then the windows. There could be more. They swept the house together, room by room, shadow by shadow. Nothing. The grounds were empty, the night silent except for the wind. It was over. Alessandro stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the bodies of men who had come to murder his family, and felt nothing. No guilt. No remorse. Only the slow fade of adrenaline and the cold satisfaction of survival. Then he heard the safe room door open. He turned, his weapon rising instinctively, and found Maribel standing at the end of the hallway. She had left the safe room, against his orders, against all reason, and now she stood frozen, staring at him. At the blood on his hands. The bodies on the floor. The monster he had always been. Alessandro waited for the fear to return to her eyes. Waited for her to shrink away from him, to see him as the savage he truly was. But Maribel didn't run. She walked toward him, stepping over the dead without looking down, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She stopped inches away, close enough to touch, and looked up at him with something he hadn't seen in her eyes since the alley. Recognition. I remember, she whispered, her voice breaking. You always protected us. She collapsed into his arms, and Alessandro held her, blood-soaked hands and all. The silence after violence is its own kind of wound. 3 days had passed since the breach. 3 days since Alessandro had walked back into the safe room, his shirt soaked with blood that wasn't his, and found Aloan asleep in Maribel's arms. 3 days since Maribel had looked at him, really looked at him, and seen not a monster, but a man who would burn the world to keep them safe. The bodies were gone. The broken windows replaced. The blood scrubbed from the marble floors until no trace remained. But Maribel had retreated somewhere Alessandro couldn't follow. She sat in the sunroom for hours, staring at nothing, her hands limp in her lap. She ate when Aloan brought her food. She slept when exhaustion claimed her. But the fragile progress they had made, the almost smiles, the tentative touches, had vanished, buried under the weight of memories the attack had unearthed. Alessandro watched her from the doorway, helpless in a way he had never been. He could kill a man with his bare hands. He could dismantle a rival family in a single night. But he could not reach into his wife's shattered mind and put the pieces back together. He had never felt more useless in his life. On the 4th morning, Aloan took matters into her own hands. Alessandro heard her small footsteps padding down the hallway, followed by a dragging sound he couldn't identify. He stepped out of his office and found his daughter struggling to carry the battered guitar case, the one Maribel had clutched like a lifeline since the alley, the one she hadn't touched since the attack. "Stellina," he said quietly. "What are you doing?" Eloane looked up at him, her face set with determination. "Mama needs her music, Papa. She's sad because she forgot how to sing." "Mama." The word hit Alessandro like a physical blow. Eloane had started using it 2 days ago, slipping it into conversation as naturally as breathing. Maribel hadn't corrected her. Hadn't even flinched. Some part of her remembered, even if her mind refused to. He watched as Eloane dragged the case into the sunroom and laid it at Maribel's feet. The woman stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Play something," Eloane said, climbing onto the couch beside her. "Please. I want to hear." Maribel's hands trembled as she reached for the latches. The case opened with a soft click, revealing the battered instrument inside, scratched, worn, but intact. She lifted it like it was made of glass. Her fingers found the strings. And stopped. She tried to form a chord, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. The fingers that had once danced across the frets were stiff, clumsy, frozen by years of cold and trauma. A broken sound emerged, discordant, wrong. Maribel's face crumpled. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't remember how." Eloane reached over and placed her small hand on Maribel's. "It's okay, Mama," she said softly. "I'll wait." Alessandro leaned against the doorframe, tears streaming down his face. The cord was broken. But his daughter believed it could be mended. And for the first time, so did he. Christmas Eve arrived with snow falling soft and silent over the estate. Alessandro had not celebrated the holiday in 5 years. After the bombing, he had removed every decoration, every reminder of the life he had lost. Christmas had become just another day, cold, empty, endured. But Eloane had insisted. She had dragged a box of ornaments from the storage room, commanded Alessandro to find a tree, and spent an entire afternoon decorating the living room with the fierce dedication of a tiny general. Maribel had watched from the couch, silent but present, her eyes following the child's movements with something that looked almost like hunger. Now the three of them sat in the glow of the Christmas lights, red and gold and white, reflected in the dark windows like scattered stars. A fire crackled in the hearth. Eloane was curled against Alessandro's side, fighting sleep with the stubbornness she had inherited from both her parents. Maribel sat apart from them, the guitar resting in her lap. She had been practicing. Every day for the past 2 weeks, she had forced her stiff fingers to remember shapes they had forgotten, coaxing broken chords into something resembling music. Alessandro had listened from the hallway, never interrupting, never pushing. Waiting. Tonight, her fingers moved to the strings without hesitation. The first notes filled the room, soft, tentative, achingly familiar. Alessandro's breath caught in his throat. He knew this melody. He had heard it 1,000 times, drifting from the nursery in their old apartment, sung in a voice like honey and heartbreak. Aurora mi niño, aurora mi sol. A Spanish lullaby. The one Maribel had sung to Eloane every night before bed, back when their daughter was small enough to fit in the crook of her arm, back when they believed they had forever. Eloane stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "I know this song," she whispered. "Mama used to sing it." Maribel's fingers faltered. Her hands stilled on the strings, and for a terrible moment, Alessandro thought she would stop. But then her lips parted, and she began to sing, softly at first, barely audible, the words rough from years of disuse. Aurora mi niño, aurora mi sol. Aurora pedazo de mi corazón. The melody swelled, filling the room, filling the empty spaces that 5 years of grief had carved into Alessandro's chest. Tears streamed down Maribel's face, but she didn't stop. Her voice grew stronger, sure, as if each note was unlocking a door that had been sealed shut. And then she looked at him. Really looked at him. Her eyes, honey brown, flecked with gold, widened with recognition. With knowing. With remembering. Alessandro, she breathed. His name. On her lips. After 5 years of silence. He was across the room before he knew he was moving, falling to his knees before her, his hands cupping her face like she might disappear if he let go. "Mi Alma," he choked. "You came back to me." Eloane scrambled off the couch and threw herself into them both, her small arms wrapping around their necks, pulling them together. "Merry Christmas, Mama," she whispered. "Merry Christmas, Papa." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, the Varelli family was whole. Please subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story.